Okay guys, another book review here, and what I'm looking at is a book that is very topical at the moment with the George Floyd shooting in America and all the sort of civil unrest. And it's a book called Why I Am No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And when you look at the top, you think it says why I'm no longer talking about race, but they've got to white people in this kind of indented, white kind of bit. So they've taken the print out of there, and it's okay. First of all, I've got to say I think that's a genius of a cover, and it makes you think about what the book's about. I think this is a new paperback version, and it's been edited a couple of times. So there's a couple of new editions have come out, and I suppose it's a book that I saw around a lot, and I know that a lot of people have read it, so people have got their own ideas about it. It's written after Obama has been elected as president, so it's at a time when people probably thought there was a kind of post-racial society where race doesn't matter anymore. And clearly, this book really brings out the idea that that's not true. I did write a few notes because there's a few things about this book that I've got to say. It's an easy to read book. It's not very long. In fact, it was written, or I should actually say it's written by Reni Eddo-Lodge, who's a black lady who was part of the kind of feminist movement, but basically felt that the fact that she's black was not being addressed. So she got finally frustrated, and she felt that a lot of white people just didn't get the idea of structural racism and the idea of white privilege. Now I know these are difficult discussions to have and to talk about, because people will get quite upset about these terms, because I think people feel that, well, I'm white, I'm not racist, so how can I be part of this issue? And maybe I should also talk about Asian people as well, although that doesn't come into this, but certainly that's something that people have to examine. So it's a very well researched book, even though it's quite small. Lots of different references, so you can tell that this lady's quite an academic. I personally, in terms of reading it, I think it's one of those essential books that you've got to read, especially in the current climate. But I did read another book called Natives by Akala, which actually had more of an impression on me. And books like Malcolm X's autobiography probably had more of an impression on me. This felt a bit more like an academic book, but it is very well written as well. So I did write a few notes, because there's just so many. It's like this book is like a densely packed protein bar. It's like full of nutrients. There's like no wastage in this book. That's one of the things I found about it. But it really looks at the idea that race is an idea that you've got to be able to see race, and if you don't see race, you don't see where race doesn't hinder you. So the idea is that actually seeing things in racial terms is essential, so that you can actually change the system. And not seeing race, as in I don't see colour, actually means that you become part of the problem, because you don't see where race is actually creates this kind of privilege, as they talk about. And she makes a real distinction about the idea about prejudice. Everybody's got prejudices, she talks about a particular thing where she goes to see, gets a burger or something somewhere, and the guy says, oh, I keep the best meat cuts for people like us. And she goes, like, that was obviously an example of a black person using structural, using racism. But the only thing he could really affect was her lunch. And what she talks about is that, prejudice is prejudice, but racism is prejudice plus power. It's the idea that you can then use that to actually affect the other person, in terms of their life choices in life. And this idea of white privilege, which people hate because they think, well, I'm not that well off, but it's the idea that it's the absence of the negative effects of racism. She talks a lot about in this about, I mean, when a lot of discussions about race relations happens, often it's about race relations in the US, which I think are different. But she does a lot to talk about race relations in the UK, and she goes through a lot of things that people haven't even heard about, and things like, the idea of the transatlantic slave trade and how it affected Britain. I think that's very important nowadays to know about, because often, the actual people weren't actually kept in Britain, but the effects of slavery, the money that came from slavery in the US and the West Indies on the plantations, was all brought back to Britain. And let's face it, it helped to build Britain and some of the structures we see around us as we're just walking through city centres. So it affects places like Glasgow, Bristol, Liverpool, London, obviously, and places like that. So she does a very good job of bringing that up in the beginning. So she talks about histories and the histories of Britain in terms of race relations. She talks a lot about the Stephen Lawrence case, which is something that I kind of knew something about, but I didn't know enough about it. So that's really quite interesting. That's really good. She talks about the Stephen Lawrence case, and that again ties into the whole idea about structural racism. Nick Griffin, there's an interview with Nick Griffin in this, and she basically reports that word for word, and that is quite interesting to see. And that's part of this chapter called Fear of a Black Planet, and it's the idea that Britain is going to get swamped by these masses, foreign masses coming over, and Britain, there's not enough people in Britain, we can't absorb it. She came out with a few interesting statistics, and there's all sorts of, it's not just statistics. She really backs up her claims with proper research. But if you ask most people, and fairly affluent people, if you ask them how many foreign-born people are in Britain, most people would say it's about at least 31%, and actually it's only about 13%, 13 or 14% in the whole of Britain. So she talks a lot about that, and apparently if you make more money, you actually become more sort of likely to think that immigrants are a drain on public services and things like that. There's a lot about feminism and racism and how the two sort of intersect. And, again, she talks about, a lot of subjects that I didn't, there's the Rotherham grooming gangs, but, the fact is that those grooming gangs are only talked about often in terms of their racial makeup or their ethnic makeup. Whereas other gangs aren't, the problem is they're not held up as a representative of a race. It's always, so basically it's always non-white groups that are held up as being inherently indicative of their race. So it's, what can I say there? I mean, I had to read a lot of chapters twice, because I didn't, a lot of the information, it was interesting, but it's difficult to kind of articulate it until you read it again. I mean, there's what can I say? There's a interesting bit that she wrote a follow-up edition to this, and that came after the Grenfell Towers and things like that, and after the election of President Trump. And there was some interesting things in that. She goes to a school somewhere in London, and she's talking to a lot of sixth formers there, and one of them asks a question that, when do you think we'll get to an end point with this? And she goes, look, there's no end point in sight. You can't skip to the resolution without having the messy conversation first. We're still in the hard bit. So I suppose for me, this is the start of reading and educating ourselves and having those messy conversations about race. And I think they're important to have. Not just important, they're imperative to have. We can deny, that there's a sky, but the sky's still there. So we can be in denial that there are issues with race and how race is played out in the UK, but the fact is it's still there. So I would really recommend anybody to read this book. I'll be honest with you, I read another book called Natives by Akala. That had more of an effect on me because I think it was one of the first books that I'd read like that. But I think this was written before that. So in that sense, I think, it maybe it didn't have the effect on me, the shock revelation factor that I was expecting it to have. Whereas the people that had told me to read this, actually, fun enough, it was a white lady that had actually told me to read this, and she said it was a real eye-opener and she was really affected by it. It didn't really have that effect on me, but I think it's one of those books I think you're going to have to read in in 2020 or soon. This is a book you're going to have to read. I personally would recommend Natives by Akala as well, but and certainly one of the other things I've realised is that there's no discussion about race that can be had in the UK without talking about the British Empire and the global British Empire. And I think probably those are one of the books I'm going to have to start reading a bit about that. And unfortunately, it does lead into some difficult conversations because things are often whitewashed and made to look much nicer than they were, as if it was a carry-on film. So I think that's probably one of those books. But this certainly, this book, Reni, Eddo-Lodge, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. I think it's one of those must-read books that you've just got to read. So I hope you'll enjoy that. I didn't talk in huge detail about the book, and I may not have summarized everything, but I think it's important to read this book as well. I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you soon, guys.